Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into one of the most complex, most discussed global issues, the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Absolutely. It's everywhere, but often deeply misunderstood.
Exactly. And let's just, right off the bat, tackle a big misconception. People often think of this as some ancient religious war going back centuries.
Right, like it's been this way forever.
But our sources are really clear. While religion is definitely a factor, that's not the core of it. It's primarily about two groups, two national movements, claiming the same piece of land.
And the conflict as we know it today is surprisingly recent. We're talking largely dating back only about a century, maybe a bit more, to the early 1900s.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how recent it is in the grand scheme of things. Less about ancient hatreds, much more about modern nationalism, colonialism, big political shifts.
Precisely. It connects to these huge global changes from just over 100 years ago.
So that's a really key distinction for you to grasp from the start. Our mission today, we want to walk you through the history, chronologically, step by step.
We'll pull out the key moments, the turning points from the material we've looked at, to help you understand the essentials, why it's still so complex.
Yeah, we want to unpack how this struggle evolved and, crucially, look at the human impact. Basically give you a solid foundation so you're really well informed.
Okay, so where do we start?
Let's go back. Early 20th century, the region along the eastern Mediterranean, what's now Israel and Palestine, it was under Ottoman rule for hundreds of years.
And the picture we get from the sources is one of diversity. Mostly Muslims and Christians, a small Jewish minority too.
And importantly, they generally lived together peacefully. There wasn't this inherent conflict back then.
But then things started to change. Around the early 1900s, you see two really significant developments happening, kind of in parallel.
Okay, what were they?
Well, first, within the region itself, among the Arab population, a stronger sense of distinct identity was emerging. People started seeing themselves not just as Arabs, but specifically as Palestinians. A Palestinian national identity began to form.
Okay, that's one. What was the other?
At the same time, over in Europe, you have the rise of Zionism.
Right. The idea that Judaism isn't just a religion, but a nationality deserving its own state.
Exactly. And driven by centuries of persecution in Europe, many Jews saw establishing a state in their ancestral homeland in the Middle East as, frankly, the only way to be safe.
And this wasn't just an idea, right? People started acting on it.
Yes. In those first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews began moving to the region, migrating there.
Then, boom, World War I. The Ottoman Empire collapses.
And the European powers, Britain and France, basically step in and carve up the Middle East.
Yeah, drawing lines on maps. Britain takes control of the area we're talking about, calling it the British Mandate for Palestine.
And you can see right there how these external colonial decisions started laying the groundwork for future conflict, couldn't they? They weren't necessarily thinking about the long-term aspirations of the people living there.
So the British are in charge. What happens with Jewish immigration then?
Initially, the British allowed it to continue. But as more Jewish immigrants arrived, buying land, setting up communities, farming communes often.
Tensions started rising.
Yeah, tensions between Jewish immigrants and the local Arab population grew quickly. The sources mentioned violence flaring up, committed by both sides.
So the British policy wasn't really working to keep the peace?
No. And by the 1930s, the British actually tried to backtrack, started limiting Jewish immigration.
How did that go down?
Well, it led to another reaction.
Huh.
Jewish militias formed. They started fighting not only local Arabs, but also resisting British rule itself. It became this complex three-way struggle almost.
So the British were kind of caught in the middle, trying to manage these two competing national movements they'd, in part, enabled.
That's a good way to put it. Their attempts to balance things often just seem to make the friction worse.
Okay, let's fast forward into the 1940s. The backdrop is horrific. The Holocaust in Europe.
A truly devastating event. And it had a massive impact on this situation, too. Many more Jewish refugees fled Europe, heading for British Palestine.
And it wasn't just about refugees, right? It shifted global opinion.
Absolutely. The world was reeling from the Holocaust, and it created this huge wave of international support for the idea of a Jewish state, a safe haven.
Meanwhile, back in Palestine, the violence between Arabs and Jews was just getting worse.
Right. So the British basically washed their hands of it and turned the problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
And the UN came up with a plan in 1947, the Partition Plan.
Yes. The idea was to divide the territory of British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, one for Arabs, Palestine.
And Jerusalem, always a sensitive point.
Jerusalem, because it's holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, was proposed as a special international zone run by the UN, kind of a compromise.
So the plan aimed to give both groups national independence and hopefully stop the fighting. How was it received?
It was a split decision, really. The Jewish leadership, they accepted the plan. They saw it as international legitimacy for their state, and they declared Israel's independence based on it.
But the other side?
The Palestinian Arab leadership and Arab leaders in neighboring countries, they rejected it completely.
Why?
They saw it as basically European colonialism continuing, taking their land, giving a large part of it away without their consent. An injustice.
So that rejection, that difference in perspective, really set the stage for immediate conflict.
It did. War broke out almost immediately in 1948. Several newly independent Arab states invaded the new state of Israel.
What was their goal?
Their declared aim was to prevent the partition and establish a single Arab state across all the territory, to essentially stop Israel from existing.
But that's not what happened.
No. Israel won the war.
Yeah.
And in the process, its military pushed well beyond the borders the UN had proposed.
Taking more land.
Yes, including the western half of Jerusalem and a lot of the territory that the UN plan had actually allocated for the Arab state.
And this war had another huge, lasting consequence, the refugee issue.
A devastating one. During the fighting, Israeli forces expelled vast numbers of Palestinians from their homes and villages, hundreds of thousands.
Creating a huge refugee population.
Exactly, and their descendants today number around 7 million people, many still living in refugee camps or scattered across the region and the world. It's a core issue that persists to this day.
It's almost hard to fathom the scale of that displacement and how it echoes down through generations.
It truly is. And we should also note, during this period and after, many Jews living in Arab countries faced persecution, hostility, and many fled or were expelled, finding refuge in the new state of Israel. So there were population movements in both directions.
So after the 1948 war, what did the map look like?
Israel controlled most of the former British Mandate territory. The main exceptions were the Gaza Strip, which came under Egyptian control, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which was controlled by Jordan.
And this, you said, marks the real start of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict.
Yes, this set the battle lines politically and territorially for decades to come.
Okay, so that's 1948. But then there's another pivotal war, less than 20 years later, in 1967.
Right, the Six-Day War.
Mm-hmm.
Another major conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, primarily Egypt, Jordan, and Syria.
And the outcome?
A swift and decisive Israeli victory, leading to massive territorial changes again.
What did Israel capture this time?
Israel seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the entire Sinai Peninsula, and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and crucially, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan.
Wow. So after 1967, Israel controlled all the territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, plus Sinai and Golan.
Correct. And this is a monumental shift, because now Israel wasn't just bordering these Palestinian areas, it was occupying them, the West Bank and Gaza.
Including East Jerusalem and its holy sites.
Yes, and this meant Israel was now responsible for governing the lives of millions of Palestinians living in those territories.
So the dynamic changes completely. From fighting against Arabs in neighboring states to directly ruling over Palestinians.
Precisely. This is where the conflict starts to transform from a broader Arab-Israeli struggle into the more focused Israeli-Palestinian conflict centered on occupation.
Did this occupation change the diplomatic landscape too?
It did, although it took time. A key moment was in 1978 with the Camp David Accords, brokered by the U.S.
Right, between Israel and Egypt.
Yes. Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for a formal peace treaty, the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation.
I remember that was hugely controversial in the Arab world.
Extremely. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was widely condemned by other Arab leaders and was tragically assassinated a few years later, partly because of it.
But it did signal a shift.
It did. It marked sort of the beginning of the end for the large-scale state-on-state Arab-Israeli wars. Over the following decades, other Arab countries, like Jordan, eventually made peace with Israel too.
So with the wider regional conflict de-escalating, the focus zoomed right in.
Exactly, right onto the core issue. Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and the struggle of the Palestinians living under that occupation.
And this is where the PLO becomes even more central, right? The Palestine Liberation Organization.
Yes. Formed back in the 60s, the PLO aimed to establish a Palestinian state. For years, they waged a struggle against Israel, which included Acts of terrorism?
Their initial goal was the destruction of Israel?
Initially, yes. Their charter called for liberating all of Palestine, meaning ending Israel. But later, particularly under Yasser Arafat's leadership, the PLO signaled it might accept a two-state solution, a division of the land.
But the fighting continued for a long time. I recall the 1982 Lebanon War.
Right, where Israel invaded Lebanon specifically to target and expel the PLO, who were based in Beirut at the time. It was a brutal conflict.
Okay, so while all this political and military maneuvering is happening, something else is starting on the ground, inside the occupied territories.
Yes, something with profound long-term consequences. Israeli civilians began moving into the West Bank and Gaza, establishing settlements.
The settlers, why did they move there?
Our sources point to a mix of motivations. For some, it was religious belief that Jews have a divine right to live in all of that land. For others, it was more nationalist, wanting to claim the land definitively for Israel.
And practical reasons, too.
Yes, often housing was much cheaper in the settlements, and the Israeli government frequently subsidized them, encouraging people to move.
What was the impact on Palestinians living there?
Huge. These settlements often required confiscating Palestinian land. They disrupt Palestinian communities, restrict movement. They're often heavily guarded by the Israeli military. They fundamentally change the landscape.
So it makes daily life under occupation harder, more painful.
Definitely. But the bigger issue the sources emphasize is the long-term one. These settlements, by breaking up Palestinian territory, make it physically much, much harder to ever create a viable, independent Palestinian state.
It's like creating facts on the ground that prevent a future solution.
That's exactly the point many observers make. They're seen as a major obstacle to peace, particularly a two-state solution. And today, there are several 100,000 settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
And the international view on this.
The vast majority of the international community considers these settlements illegal under international law, as they violate the Geneva Conventions regarding occupied territory.
Okay, so tensions are building, settlements are expanding. What happens next?
By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration, desperation really, it just boiled over. This led to the first Intifada.
Intifada Arabic for uprising.
Yes, it started mostly with protests, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience. But it also involved stone throwing and eventually more violent confrontations.
How did Israel respond?
With significant force. The images from that time were quite stark. In the end, the casualty figures were grim. Around a couple hundred Israelis killed and over 1,000 Palestinians.
And it's around this time that another major Palestinian group emerges.
Yes, Hamas. Formed in Gaza during the First Intifada. They saw the PLO as too secular, too willing to compromise with Israel.
And Hamas's position?
Our sources describe Hamas as an Islamist group, designated as a terrorist organization by many countries, explicitly dedicated to Israel's destruction and the establishment of an Islamic State in its place. They rejected any negotiation or compromise.
So you have these increasingly hardline elements gaining prominence.
Right, which made the next development even more remarkable, perhaps. In the early 1990s, there was a major breakthrough, the Oslo Accords.
A peace process brokered with U.S. help again?
Yes. Secret negotiations between Israeli officials and the PLO led to mutual recognition and these accords. The basic idea was a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces and the gradual establishment of Palestinian self-government, leading, hopefully, to a final peace deal and an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel.
So a path towards two states.
That was the framework. The Oslo Accords created the Palestinian Authority, or PA, giving Palestinians limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza for the first time.
This must have been met with huge hope.
There was hope, yes, but also fierce opposition from extremists on both sides.
How so?
Hamas immediately launched a wave of suicide bombings inside Israel, aiming to kill civilians and completely derail the peace process. They wanted no peace with Israel.
And on the Israeli side?
The Israeli right wing was furious. They held mass protests against the Accords. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the agreement, was labeled a traitor, even a Nazi, by some extreme protesters.
And this opposition had tragic consequences.
Deeply tragic.
Yeah.
In 1995, shortly after signing the second phase of the Oslo Accords, Rabin was assassinated. Not by a Palestinian, but by a right-wing Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process.
A shocking moment, and it really showed.
It starkly showed how powerful extremists on either side were, how they could use violence to potentially veto any move towards peace. It cast a long shadow.
Did the peace process survive Rabin's assassination?
It limped along for a few more years, but the momentum was badly damaged. Negotiations to reach a final agreement on the toughest issues, borders, refugees, Jerusalem, settlements they drag on.
I remember another big summit, Camp David in 2000.
Yes, a major effort led by President Clinton to broker a final deal between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. But it collapsed. No agreement was reached.
And the result of that failure?
Widespread Palestinian disillusionment. Many felt that the peace process wasn't going to deliver independence, that negotiations had failed. This frustration exploded into the Second Intifada in late 2000.
Was this different from the first one?
Much more violent. It involved suicide bombings by Palestinian militant groups, including Hamas, targeting Israeli civilians on buses and cafes, and Israel responded with major military operations in the West Bank and Gaza. It was a brutal period.
The death toll was much higher too, wasn't it?
Yes, significantly. By the time the main violence subsided a few years later, around 1,000 Israelis had been killed and over 3,000 Palestinians.
What was the lasting impact of the Second Intifada?
It really poisoned the atmosphere. On the Israeli side, it shattered much of the remaining belief that a negotiated peace was possible, or that Palestinians truly wanted peace.
Leading to a political shift.
Definitely. Israeli politics moved further to the right. The focus shifted away from seeking a final resolution and towards separation and management of the conflict.
Is this when Israel started building the barrier, the wall?
Yes, the controversial separation barrier, mostly along and inside the West Bank, was constructed during and after the Second Intifada, along with many more checkpoints. The idea was security, controlling Palestinian movement to prevent attacks.
And for Palestinians?
A profound sense of despair set in. They felt that neither the Oslo negotiations nor the violence of the Intifada had achieved anything positive. They were still under occupation, settlements were still expanding, and the prospect of statehood seemed further away than ever.
So the hope of the Oslo years was gone.
Largely evaporated, yes, replaced by cynicism and deadlock.
Then came another major change, specifically regarding Gaza.
Right, in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew all its settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip.
A complete pullout from Gaza. What happened next there?
Political turmoil. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections. This led to a power struggle with the PLO-dominated Palestinian Authority, culminating in a short, violent conflict in Gaza in 2007.
And Hamas took full control of Gaza.
Yes, effectively splitting the Palestinian territories politically and geographically. Hamas ruling Gaza, the PA having limited authority in parts of the West Bank, a division that persists today.
And Israel's response to Hamas controlling Gaza.
Israel, along with Egypt, imposed a strict blockade on Gaza, severely restricting the movement of goods and people in and out.
What's the impact of that blockade?
Devastating for Gaza's economy and population. The sources describe it as suffocating. Unemployment has soared, sometimes reaching 40% or even higher. Basic services are strained. Life is incredibly difficult for ordinary Gazans.
So this brings us closer to the present day. How would you characterize the situation now, based on the sources?
The sources paint a picture of a conflict that's maybe less intense daily than during the Intifadas, but deeply entrenched and, as one source put it, unbearable for Palestinians.
How does it play out differently in the West Bank versus Gaza?
In the West Bank, the main story is the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements, which continue to fragment Palestinian land and communities. There are ongoing tensions, protests, occasional violence, clashes with settlers or soldiers. But most Palestinians, the sources suggest, just want a normal life free from occupation.
And Gaza?
Gaza remains under blockade, ruled by Hamas. There have been periodic devastating wars between Hamas and other militant groups and Israel. These conflicts cause immense destruction in Gaza and overwhelmingly kill Palestinians, many of them civilians, while also causing casualties and terror in Israel through rocket fire.
And what about Israeli society? How does the conflict impact daily life there?
For many Israelis, particularly those living away from Gaza or the West Bank boundaries, the occupation can feel somewhat removed from their day-to-day lives, thanks to the separation barrier and military control. It's punctuated by these periods of intense violence, which are terrifying, but often there's a sense of maybe apathy or resignation about the broader conflict.
And politically, is there any momentum for peace?
Very little, according to the sources. Both Israeli and Palestinian leadership seem locked in their positions, and there's not much political will or perhaps perceived ability on either side to make the major compromises needed for peace. The middle ground has shrunk.
So looking ahead, what's the prognosis?
Nobody really knows. The sources are quite stark on this. Could there be a third intifada? Could the Palestinian Authority collapse, leading to chaos in the West Bank? It's unclear.
But there's a consensus about the current situation.
Yes, a strong consensus among observers that the status quo, the current situation, is inherently unstable. It simply cannot last indefinitely.
And the fear is,
The fear, expressed quite broadly, is that without some kind of dramatic change, a shift in dynamics, whatever comes next is likely to be much worse than what we have now.
so reflecting on this whole journey we've taken, from the Ottoman era through the British Mandate, the wars, the occupation, the peace attempts, the uprisings, it's clear this isn't some timeless conflict.
Not at all. It has very specific, relatively recent historical roots. It's about nationalism, land, security, self-determination, two peoples with deep attachments to the same place, whose narratives are tragically intertwined and often in direct opposition.
And we end on this really sobering note from our sources that the situation is unstable, unsustainable, and potentially heading towards something worse.
It really leaves you thinking. If the current situation is seen as untenable by almost everyone, yet there's no clear path forward, what does that actually mean? When a conflict reaches this kind of profound impasse where both sides feel so locked into their history, their grievances, their fears, what possible new pathways could even emerge? It's a deeply troubling question.